So good morning, everyone. I think we'll start. Welcome to our webinar this morning. We are recording it, and we'll be sharing the recording afterwards. For those who join late, we shouldn't worry too much. We'll give them access to our webinar. For those who don't know me, my name is Roelof Burger. At the moment, I'm Deputy President of the National Association for Clean Air. I'm hoping we've got a lot of new potential members. So for those who don't know, NACA is the forum where government, industry, academia, and society comes together to discuss issues around air quality and climate change. And today is a very good example of the purpose of NACA, which is a really old organization. Bev can correct me, but I think we have a few years over our 50th anniversary. So it's a really a special place where we can make sure that the conversation keeps on going. And it's not only talking about problems, but also making sure that that talk goes over into action. So obviously the science policy interface for us is central to what NACA is all about. And today is therefore really a great opportunity for us to put action to words when we review this draft policy around the South African Atmospheric Emissions License and Inventory Portal Data Management System. So for us, it's a good opportunity. Another thing that we want to do in NACA is we want to give a platform for emerging researchers, and for that reason, I've asked Farina Lindeke to be the host for today. So without further ado, I'll be handing over to her. Just a few administrative issues. We will be doing a survey after the speakers, and we want to share that the survey results with you at the end of the webinar. So what's important for us is that you keep on engaging with us through the Zoom chat, and if you send us questions for the survey, we hope to not make it too long, but we will include all of those questions that we can into the survey, and then just after the speakers, while we're busy with the question and answers, we will make sure that you all get the link. The last administrative issue is to remind you that we've got the conference that's coming up the beginning of October. The early bird registration is still open. There's also some funding opportunities that's still left. So if there's any companies that's interested to join us, and then for the young scientists out there, this is the way to meet the people in the country that's interested in this field from all walks of life. It's also where we want you to be sharing your ideas with us. So I think it's a really exciting place where NACA serves the community. There's also grants available. So if there's any of you that's struggling with finances to join us, please let us not make that the reason you can't join. And the last announcement I can make is congratulations to all of you for the Clean Air Day that we had yesterday. And I hope you all saw the action from the Clean Air Journal, which is our journal in the community, which is a really great initiative. Although NACA oversees and helps to make sure that we can keep the journal going, it's totally independent, the editorial board, which is really important for academic integrity. And it's one of the few places where you can publish your papers very quickly, efficiently, and without the exorbitant fees that typically goes with these kind of publications. So we also appreciate them. I think that's it from me. Over to Farina, who will be our chair and will be introducing the speakers for the day.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Roelof. You missed your calling. You should have gone into marketing, I think. You did a good job there. I'd like to say welcome to everybody that attended or in attendance. We've got great numbers today, and especially warm welcome to our panel of experts that are giving us some of their time today to help unpack this draft legislation or draft policy. I am not going to spend too much time talking about the policy. That is what we have our experts for. And I would also like to give a special welcome to my colleague Iselke Botha and her third-year impact study students that are joining us today. I think it is great, like Roelof said, this is a great forum for everyone in the environmental community to come together. And I think it's a great opportunity for young people to see how draft legislation, how these discussions take place, as they are going to be our environmental practitioners and legislators in the future. So a special welcome to all the students here. And remember that there are student memberships to NACA also. You can find details on the website if you are interested to join NACA. So I think without further ado, I am going to just give a quick overview of our panel for today. We have three distinguished speakers that have been involved in air quality management on different levels and different areas of air quality management, and they're going to give us an overview from the different perspectives today. So we have Dr. Terry Bird from Airshed Planning Professionals, Mr. Quentin Hurd from Skyside, and Mr. Ian Sampson from Shepston and Wiley Attorneys. That will give us a more in-depth look at the legal side of things. Just a request from Brigitte Language and Gerard Botha, who are the behind-the-scenes tech team today. If you have a question for one of the presenters or for the panel, please type it in the text box. They will keep all the questions together. We're going to try our best to keep our discussions or do the discussion session at the end of our webinar. If you have a question that you want to be included in the survey that Roelof spoke about, please make sure that you just type. Brigitte has an instruction in the text box. But please, if you want your question to be included in the survey, just start with survey and then your question. If you are addressing a question at a specific presenter, please just indicate at the beginning of your question that it is a question for the presenter. And if it is just a general question for the panel as a whole, just start your question with the keyword panel, so they can just make sure that we keep all the questions together in the correct categories. So I'm going to start off by introducing our first speaker, Dr. Terry Bird. While I introduce her, she'll start sharing her slides, etc. So Dr. Terry Bird is a senior consultant at Airshed Planning Professionals. She holds a PhD from the University of the Witwatersrand, and she is a senior consultant at Airshed Planning Professionals. In her time at Airshed Planning Professionals, Dr. Bird has been involved in air quality impact assessments for various mining, power generation, and industrial processes. And she's also been a team member on the development of air quality management plans for air quality priority areas, provincial, metropolitan areas, and for specific industries. She will present today. She will present some inputs on the draft policy from the perspective of air quality specialist consultants as a combined effort from the Airshed team. Welcome, Dr. Bird.
Thanks very much, Farina. And thank you to NACA for inviting us to present today. So yes, as discussed, the presentation was prepared by the Airshed team and focuses on the the data management policy. So, sorry, I'm just, all right. So just to remind everyone, SAAELIP, as the South African Atmospheric Emission License and Information Portal, is the top level portal. And this draft policy has an objective to provide guidance on the collection, use, and dissemination of this data. SAAELIP itself has these three kind of pillars or silos of platforms that have different functions. The first is NEAS, which is for AEL atmospheric license holders and other facilities that are required annually to report their emissions. We pronounce the next silo as SNAIL, but that might not be the most appropriate pronunciation. But SNAIL is the application and administration platform for the atmospheric emission license. And then SAGES or SAGAs, I've also heard it referred to. It's a collection of 5-letter acronyms this morning. This is the greenhouse gas emissions reporting platform, and this is especially focused on non-listed activities, so waste activities that won't have an AEL, for example, waste and mining and forestry and a few others. So the way we've read this draft policy, which if you haven't yet read, my presentation talks to you having read it, but if you haven't, I see Bridget has shared a link to the actual document. So perhaps you can look at that afterwards. So the way we read this draft documentation is this distinct focus on the AEL platforms, both NAS and SNAIL, and access within those. So our talk today is really around, or focuses or uses this lens of looking at the draft policy through the lens of developing an equality management plan, and be those plans appropriate for priority areas, provincial, municipalities, or even a new facility through the EIA process. All of these equality management plans are based on a sound and robust baseline or status quo of the airshed. And this can be assessed either from a measured, a network of monitoring stations that are measuring the baseline, or via dispersion modeling simulations. For these simulated baselines, access to comprehensive emission inventories is key to the development of objectives and goals of the management plan. If the goal, those questions or the answers from dispersion modeling and from measured networks about the baseline will help establish whether a goal needs to be maintaining compliance with air quality standards or developing strategies towards achieving compliance in that airshed. And as we read through the documentation, we came across 4 areas where we think that there's room for improvements on the draft policy. And I'll go through each of them in turn. Let's start with data content. This refers specifically to policy sections 4.1 and 4.4 and 4.11. So in terms of the definition of what is public knowledge, so everyone can request access to, the policy speaks about total annual emissions for a specific facility, and then what is confidential information. And we feel that there needs to be a slightly clearer definition on these categories. The draft policy at present refers to special conditions, and those are discretionary at the Air Quality Officer's authority, which could be a local Air Quality Officer or the National Air Quality Officer. And we specifically looked and contend that the basic information that we would use in developing a management plan, or certainly, let's step back, building a specific emissions inventory, and then parameterizing a dispersion model, such as flow rates, temperature, velocities, operating hours, abatement technology, efficiency. We believe that those are not necessarily confidential and should be available to all users of the data. We do take cognizance of the fact that there are some national key points or critical infrastructure facilities where that information might not be able to be shared. And perhaps this is a recommendation that the legislation around national key points and critical infrastructure needs to be mentioned in this draft policy as well. In terms of data format, we suggest that the possible data formats actually need to be addressed somewhere in the policy, either in the template of of the data request or in the data that's available. And the reason we stipulate this is because while emission concentrations might be useful for stakeholders to assess and or challenge compliance of facilities with the minimum emission standards, if you're setting up a dispersion model to assess a baseline condition, we need really accurate emission rates in tons per annum, and the operating hours are actually more useful for dispersion modeling of a realistic baseline. And then with regards to reporting on the emissions, it is stipulated in the draft policy that the users cannot release any of that of the confidential information, which we understand and acknowledge. However, that reference needs to be given to the source of the data, and I think the citation is the DFF or DFFE and the year that the data was accessed. However, we feel as though there needs to be a little bit more definition around the indication of detail that can be released into the public domain in reports where this data is used. And the example we could think of was in airsheds, where we would typically report a summary of source apportionment on the basis of emissions. So we would categorize mines against clay brick manufacturers, against industry, against roads, against power generation. If there's only one power station in that airshed, we're then giving the game away and releasing some confidential information. So we feel that there's this clear definition of what is and isn't allowed in terms of releasing some of that information would be helpful to air quality specialists. In terms of data accuracy, we support the use of, so by consultants, the use of the information needs to be accurate, complete, and not misleading. And that is not the responsibility of the government, it is the ethical responsibility of the data users. However, we see this inconsistency between Section 4.7 of the draft policy, where it states that the government cannot be held liable for, and I'm looking at the yellow highlighted text, the accuracy or inaccuracy of information provided through SAAELIP. This is inconsistent with the purpose and objective. Specifically, our example here is at Nice, where they, from the FAQ documents on the website, the objective is to provide accurate, current, and complete information. So we feel there's a inconsistency in this data. It also is inconsistent with the roles and responsibilities of the role players associated with SAAELIP, where auditors are defined at all levels of government. So they're actually supposed to, or are, auditing the data that goes in there. We then see that the Section 4.7 goes on to say that the responsibility then lies with the user, the responsible third party, to ensure that the information is accurate, not misleading, and updated. So this places the responsibility on the data user, by the way we read it at the moment, and we think these inconsistencies need to be addressed. And then moving on to cost, the draft policy stipulates that a quotation would be given by the air quality officer for the data requested. And we recommend that there's a move to a national tariff policy. And we can see a fixed tariff for annual emissions per facility, and then a larger fixed cost per source for the very detailed information. We recommend this on the basis of transparency, and then also on the basis of costing and planning, where that cost would be passed on directly onto the client, and that could be fixed across all consultants, across all projects. And so that information is known and transparent. We also advise that this tariff should be reasonable. We suspect that if the tariffs are too high, then clients and or developers and or specialist consultants may consider excluding this baseline information, and that could jeopardize the quality of the assessment, the value of the decisions made based on that data, and therefore invalidates the whole purpose of having a national emissions inventory database. Specifically with regards to costing associated with government-to-government requests, this is section 4.4.2 of the draft policy. The data requests are stipulated to be free of charge if directed between the government departments, but becomes a commercial request as soon as third-party consultants are commissioned to request that. Based on our experience, we have been asked by government clients to request the details from other government facilities, and so we recognize that this is probably just an administrative task that we would have to stipulate that we can't ask for that. It's a simple unnecessary transfer of funds between the different parties. And it's a realistic example, for example, in neighboring metros, and you can think of City of Joburg and Ekurhuleni Municipality, where they need to manage a common airshed and have different roles in that. And so that information sharing is really valuable and important. In terms of time, we are recommending that there be clear definition of the required response times to any data request. And this is in line with meeting EIA timeframes, for example, and collation of that. We understand that there's a time period in which the data needs to be accessed and collated and checked. But there's also this time the draft policy refers to waiting for consent for access to that data. For instance, if you were asking for access to confidential information, and the data provider would then need to be would need to give consent to access to that data. We think that the condition that data will only be provided when the data provider gives permission renders this request a little bit meaningless. It excluding those the potential for commercially sensitive information in the atmospheric emission licenses. The public is affected by these emissions, and the emission data should therefore not be subjected to consent limitations. And we've given some examples here of possible timeframes in which responses can be reasonably expected.
Hi, Terry. Sorry to. Are you moving to the conclusion? Sorry, I was just sorry to give the time.
Sorry. So in conclusion, we think that in the development of management plans, access to complete emissions inventories, including source-specific detail, is really important to derive sound management goals and objectives and workable implementation strategies. And this is based on access to reliable data of a consistent level of detail, irrespective of the area where you're working in, and at a reasonable cost. And we feel that these are the areas of this draft management policy that could be amended in order to get better alignment between the objectives of the data management and the air quality practices of South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the very informative talk, Terry. We are running a bit behind schedule, and we don't have any questions in the chat box yet. So I think we will move straight to our next presentation, by Mr. Quentin Hurt, the Managing Director of SkySight. So Terry, then while I introduce Quentin, he can start sharing his slides. The title of his talk is The Triangle of Tension, the tension that unseen air pollution creates between the emitter, the citizen, and the specialist. Quentin Hurt is a chemical engineer by qualification who started working in the field of air testing in the mid-90s. Some of the earliest projects involved the development of continuous air monitoring systems for assessments in Durban South and Richards Bay, and the question of public access to information, its quality and interpretation was central to those projects. Quentin is interested in this intersections of science and politics. Welcome, Quentin.
Thank you, Farina. Just checking you can hear me and that you can see my presentation.
Yes, all good.
Okay, great. Good morning, everyone, and thank you. I'm going to be quite brief. I think I just, this is not specifically on the proposed paper, but it's really some thoughts. When Rudolph approached me, I had some quite strong thoughts about the question of the confidentiality of information and also its communication with the public, bearing in mind that the whole question of emission inventories is meant to be something that should allow government to manage the flow of information, but it should also be something that the public should be able to build trust with in industry. And this comes off the back of a number of really disasters that we have been involved in the last year. In fact, I mean, there've been 2 landfills on fire, a refinery on fire, and everyone is aware of the results of the warehouse and various warehouses, in fact, that were on fire recently, and followed by that quite sharply, factories on fire. And you know, this has obviously created a lot of anxiety amongst members of the public that live around these facilities, but it creates this tension between the various parties, between the source of the emission on one hand, the people that live around it, and then of course us as specialists that get involved in this and try and communicate. And I just wanted to touch on some of those issues. If you are interested in this, I can really recommend Jack Ewing's book, which unpacked the Volkswagen emissions scandal. He goes into a lot of these issues and deals with a very high-profile case where you know, emissions were tried to kept quiet. And I think the moral of the book is that at the end of the day, everyone finds out about it. And I think, sure, the information might have been confidential at one point, but the real casualty was reputation, and the reputation of a very well-known brand. And I think that that's something that should inform a lot of these discussions. But let's just go back to that, what I've called the triangle of tension, and think about the perspectives of each of the 3 groups of people that are involved. And I think in this triangle, I have left the question of government out of it, but I think government and technicians really face pretty much the same issues. And so I think the 2 terms can be used interchangeably. So let's look at those 3 positions. So the citizens are generally fearful and often very angry because they feel left out of the process and they don't have the access to information, which I believe that they deserve. The operator of the source is generally defensive. This is a new situation for them. Then it's not probably something that they woke up the morning that this disaster happened and ever expected to have to deal with. And then there's the technician. And I think often we are tentative. We're not used to being thrown into these situations. And so we're quite nervous and quite frankly, not sure of a lot of the results that we are having to look at it. And that makes for a very difficult 3-point communication. So let's look at some of those positions in a bit more detail. So as I said, for the technicians, I mean, the first step is really, you know, the first position is really one of being tentative. And we are faced really with an absence of baseline data. And that's really a problem now because right at the beginning, we don't know how to interpret some of the results that we're seeing. I mean, is it normal that this is the situation in this area? Do we normally see mercury here, for instance? I mean, is there, why would there be mercury in this situation? Is it associated with the disaster, or is it something that's new? And then also we need to bring this process to a conclusion. When is it right? When is this a normal situation again? So that baseline data and the absence of baseline data makes our position very difficult. And then there's the range of issues and chemicals that we're dealing with. Often we don't have the right equipment at short notice to bring that out. And also, I think that our ability to deal with some of these disasters from a chemical analytical perspective is limited. And that's something that's very clear in the case of the warehouse in Durban, which housed a whole range of different chemicals, components, and to find laboratories that can actually process some of them, even internationally, is difficult. I want to also mention this question of odor. It's not dealt with in many of the in any of the inventories, as far as I can see, but often it's the major complaint from members of the public, and our ability to deal with odor is limited, and I think it's the source of much of the anxiety that we have to respond to. So our responses, which are typically concentration and species based, are often found wanting when we communicate. So let's look at the citizens' perspective. Really, the citizens want information. They want data on what the situation is. What is the air quality? But then when that data is presented, it's often difficult for people to understand that information. So there needs to be a more considered effort, and I think there's a space for NACA to teach people and to provide maybe crash courses on how to interpret air quality data. But at the end of the day, people want a lot of data, but then they also want an expression of whether the place is safe or not. And that's, I think, a very difficult situation. And we also now increasingly facing the citizen science. It's very instructive to me that in the case of, for instance, KZN resins, that some of the first samples taken were actually taken by the community, not by government, not by the technicians, but I'm also aware that many NGOs are now buying their own equipment to measure air quality. And so I think that increasingly people are armed with data, and that's going to create a very interesting space for debate. Why is this happening? Well, I think that there's a trust deficit. People don't trust the technicians, they don't trust government, they certainly don't trust the source of the emission. And so, again, that creates for a very fraught and difficult discussion. And lastly, I want to mention this, and I thought long about it because obviously we're faced with the question of not distinguishing on gender. But my impression is that the bulk of the most tenacious and most ardent citizens in dealing with these issues are women that are protecting families, and I think that's something that we're seeing. And it's a very brave, outspoken citizens that are leading the charge and making sure that their kids are safe. And so when we communicate, we need to remember that we're communicating to a very driven and very committed group of people that won't back down, and it makes again for a very, very interesting debate. Finally, let's look at the source. I think that the sources are typically defensive, they're secretive, because they're not sure how to deal with this. As I mentioned, it's not something that you wake up in the morning and think that you're going to deal with on any given day. And I think generally people are not prepared for the expense associated with environmental monitoring. It's always been a secondary issue, and so there's a lot of hand-wringing and accusations about the expense associated with doing some of these tests. And also, I would imagine that the source operator, if the factory's burnt down or something's on fire, is dealing with multiple business issues and dealing with many different parties. And from our perspective, the technician, we're dealing with one specific area of that. And so, getting airtime in that type of discussion is often difficult. So where I think this is going, I think that increasingly this is becoming a legal discussion. I think the lawyers are leading the charge, so I'll be very interested to hear what Ian has to say. It's very data demanding because there's so many issues that have to be ticked off. We have to look at so many things. We have to make sure we haven't missed something. And then we have to make sure that the record keeping associated with that is absolutely impeccable. I do believe that citizen communication is key. And for this reason, I honestly feel that we need to be more open about the air quality data that we produce. I think it will address the trust deficit. And I don't think that we should be charging for it. That's my personal opinion. I think that this should be information that is freely available to all citizens. And the more we restrict it, the more we damage the debate. The language needs to be simple. We really need to look at how we communicate about air quality to members of the public who don't have a chemical background and who really, as I say, want to make sure that families are safe and that children are safe. And we need to be very clear and very precise in our language. And finally, I think we need this baseline. People need to understand where we are. They need to deal with the air pollution issues that are happening despite these disasters. And then we need to be able to say we have reached the point where we're at the baseline again. And so I think that the baseline is absolutely critical. And Farina, that is my contribution. I hope it stirs some debate, and I look forward to answering any questions.
Thank you very much, Quentin. That was very interesting. And I have to say that I agree wholeheartedly with your take on involving citizens in the process and in the fight for clean air. I think they're a very underused resource and weapon in our arsenal. Thank you very much for that. Please, everyone, remember, if you have a question, pop it in the text box, the chat box. Let us know if it is something you would like to include in the broader survey. Then just use the keyword survey. Or if you have a specific question for one of our panel members, use the keyword panel. Or for a specific presenter, just use the keyword presenter. But it doesn't seem like there's any pressing questions right now. If you do have a question, please feel free to raise your hand, and we will unmute you and give you an opportunity to speak. But let's now hear from Mr. Ian Sampson, who's a partner and head of Environmental and Clean Energy Law Department at Shepstone and Wiley Attorneys, who will be giving us a presentation on cleaning the air on access to dirty data. So Ian is a specialist environmental lawyer, advising clients in both the public and private sector on a range of environmental and clean energy issues. Ian assists companies in a number of industries, including mining and resources, utilities, chemicals, steel, agriculture, automotive, waste, storage, building, and transport on a range of environmental issues. These include environmental compliance assessments, due diligence assessments, contractual issues, structured finance, environmental management systems, opinions on new and pending legislation, as well as permit and licensing requirements. So Ian is a member of the South African Environmental Law Association, the National Association for Clean Air, the South African Institute of Waste Management, and the International Association for Impact Assessment. Thank you very much for your time, Ian. We're looking forward to your presentation.
Thanks, Rena. Just to check you can hear and see my presentation. Yeah, me, I should say.
Yes, everything is fine on my side. If any of the attendees are experiencing a problem, please just pop us a chat in the chat box.
Thanks, Rena. Yeah, good morning to everybody, and thanks very much for having me on your webinar this morning. And certainly it's sometimes difficult coming last, but I must be honest, I thought Terry and Quentin's presentations were excellent and really a good introduction to my presentation, which, like theirs, I'm going to keep fairly short and succinct, but hopefully touch on a couple of the key points. And it's really, as I've indicated in my topic, cleaning, I suppose, or clearing the air on access to dirty data. Perhaps a bit of a play on the words, but it's really revolves around what both Terry and Quinton were talking about, trying to understand exactly how and where and when we can get access to some very important information and very important data, both for government, for the broader society, as Quinton was discussing, and for industry itself, for that matter. Obviously, the more information they have, hopefully the more that they can improve. So this, oops, let me find the right button to this draft policy that we've discussing this morning. Really, for some strange reason, it was published in 2 iterations. The first one was at the beginning of July, and then a duplicate copy was published a bit later in July, on the 16th of July, for consultation, as I've put up there. Strangely enough, there are a couple of typos that you'll see in the drafts. I'm sure if you've read through it, you'll have picked some of them up. I would have thought that if they went to the effort of publishing it a second time in the same month, they might have picked up on those typos, but they haven't. So there are a few errors that we need to also clear up when you go through the document. But importantly, what the Minister says in her introduction to the notice, whichever one you choose to read, the earlier one or the later one, what she says is that this consultation process that she's put out for us to all look at is really to consider an undertaking which she says was made in paragraph 5.2.4.3 of the national framework. And that's obviously the latest national framework which has been published under the Air Quality Act. And that undertaking really relates to this entire data management of information which is generated under the Air Quality Act and the various regulations which have been published under that act. So I've paraphrased in the second bullet point there what paragraph 5.2.4.3 says and what it undertakes. And keep in mind that the national framework is really a guiding document or a guideline document for government itself. It's really directing the government on how it should implement the Air Quality Act. So there's 3 key points that it makes around developing a data management policy. The first is that the emissions inventory and summary of atmospheric emission licenses must be available on SAAELIP. Sorry, I'll borrow from Terry's pronunciation of these acronyms. I'm hoping that she's got a better handle on them than perhaps I have. The second undertaking it talks to is the data management policy must specify protocols and levels of accessibility for all users. So in theory, what it's supposed to be doing is precisely what Terry and Quinton have been talking about. It's going to guide us on how we're going to collect data and how we're going to release it. And I've highlighted the bottom one because really that's the balance which this policy is trying to achieve. It's trying to balance the obligation and the requirement to collect data relating to atmospheric emissions. It's got to consider how to disseminate it, but at the same time, it's got to consider how to protect certain data. And already, as you can hear from the discussions, that last one is probably where the difficulty comes in, because air quality affects all of us. It doesn't have boundaries, as we know, and therefore we probably all assume that we should be given maximum access to this data rather than minimum access. But what this document does, and for those of you who've been through it, you will have seen it already, and I'll just paraphrase it in the next slide or two, but it really tries to achieve that balance between those 3 legs. Whether it's achieved that sufficiently or not, we've already heard some comments back, and I'm sure there's a lot more that will need to be considered. So the policy itself, the draft policy, really emphasizes the fact that its aim is to give effect to the national framework for those 3 pillars which Terry spoke about, SAAELIP, as well as the emissions inventory system and the atmospheric emission license portal that have been created. And it's going to do that, as it indicates, in the context of the broader legislative framework. And it lists in that policy all the legislation that the Minister believes are the key pieces of legislation that she has to now balance. I won't go through all of those in detail because the document itself does it, I think, quite well, both in the text as well as in the annexure. It sort of picks up on the key sections of that legislation and highlights where they, which are relevant and specific to this particular policy. But maybe just to highlight the difficulty that the minister has, and it comes to that conundrum that Quinton referred to in his discussion. We've got a constitution, as we all know, and hopefully we all know, which has a set of entrenched rights. And again, if you look carefully at those entrenched rights, it's a process of trying to balance public rights versus private rights on a continual basis. So we hopefully all know that we have this Section 24 entrenched environmental right, and that right really, read in its narrowest or its broadest terms, is giving us all a right to information that is going to have some implication on our health, safety and well-being, and that of the environment around us. And at the same time, our Constitution contains a right to privacy, and each individual is entitled to a degree of privacy, and we can't therefore allow information which relates to private individuals, or as we'll discuss in a moment, some of their proprietary information to be disseminated. And that's really to protect the health and safety of that individual in some instances. I know that may sound dramatic, and of course there's it leaves itself open to abuse because people will hide behind those sort of protections. But there are going to be instances, and there are instances we must appreciate, where the privacy of individuals is going to become important and needs to be protected. So, excuse me, those constitutional pillars were really fleshed out back in 2000, not long after the Constitution was gazetted, to the Promotion of Access to Information Act. And that act is probably an underutilized or a poorly utilized piece of legislation. In fact, contains a lot of very important information relevant to this policy document that we're considering today, because it sets out from both a public's perspective and from a private perspective how and when you should be given access to information. It's not a particularly efficient or efficiently used, as I said, piece of legislation, but it does set out the parameters, excuse me, I think particularly clearly. What we've got is then on top of that, a layer of other legislation, which reinforces that, and I'll come back to the papaya one, because that's really the outlier for the purposes of our discussion. But the National Environmental Management Act, Air Quality Act, and even the National Framework sort of align themselves a great deal with both the constitutional right as well as with the PIA provisions. So they are encouraging decisions to be taken in an open and a transparent manner wherever possible. That's in broad terms what they're trying to achieve. Papaya or papaya is a far more recent beast, and that really deals with the protection of personal information. And it's an act which all of us are coming to grips with still. I know we have an entire team in our firm that is assisting both the firm and our clients with trying to understand where and how to protect personal information. I'm not an expert on this particular act, so if those of you are saving up questions to ask me around papaya or papaya, I'm probably going to only be able to answer them at a very cursory level, if at all. But it is an act which plays a role in terms of how this particular policy that we're considering today has been addressed. So that's, as I said, is the difficulty which our minister has had to consider, or the context in which she's had to try and develop this data management policy around the Air Quality Act and information that goes along with it. For those of you who've had a look at the draft policy already, you'll be familiar with that schedule. I think it's Schedule 1, and I think it sets out quite neatly, with some exceptions, one or two which Terry picked up, in terms of where the different role players or stakeholders, as they're listed across the top of that slide, will have authority and access to particular information. So, for example, it uses phrases in national, provincial, and metro, and even the facility or the data provider around management of information. They don't really define what management of information means. So that's an area that certainly I think should be cleared up a little bit. And it then refers to Appendix 2, as you can see at the bottom of the first 4 columns. And strangely, again, it doesn't, if you go to Appendix 2, I can't see any specific reference to the facility or data provider in that schedule itself. So whether that's just a typo or whether there's an omission that still needs to be dealt with in terms of Appendix 2 explaining how a facility or data provider can go about their business. We'll have to see. But that table, which again, I won't go through because either read it or it's really easy to follow if you go to the document, is then taken a step further by the draft policy and drills down into some of the practicalities of how data collection and data dissemination is going to be dealt with. I've listed a couple of the headings, the key headings from the draft policy in this slide. Again, we won't go through them. They're easy enough to follow. Excuse me. But just to touch on a few of them. First, it obviously deals with data collection and reporting. Then talks about data use, but that's specifically limited to government's use of data. It sort of describes the purpose of government using air quality data. And then it talks about data dissemination. And I put in brackets there, and I'm paraphrasing it, but it's, again, refers specifically to legislation. So what this draft policy is saying, it's helping us to a degree, as we'll see in the next slide, but it's also really, it's sort of avoiding the detail, if I can put it that way, by saying ultimately data dissemination is going to be based on legislative requirements and legislative limitations. But where it does help us a little bit with some practicalities, it revolves around the data request. And it explains that this is really where the public wants more information than what is published. Because what the document does in the earlier headings that I've listed up there, it does indicate, and those of you who are familiar with the portals, you'll be aware that there's a degree of information which the government is committed to publish annually, but which everybody should have access to. It should be on the portal. But this is where particular members of the public, or government for that matter, require additional information going beyond what is published annually on the portal, should be published annually on the portal, and the procedure that they then need to follow in order to access it. Now, what it does is it allows for limited facility information to be made available. And I know there was some, I don't know if it was Quinton or Terry mentioned particular parameters around stacks. I think it may have been Terry. My understanding, and you guys are the scientists, so you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but it does allow for sort of source or facility-based information around the stacks and abatement equipment to be released where it's requested. However, with that third little sub-bullet point, the important issue, and perhaps this is the difficulty that Quinton has highlighted, is that particular information is going to be limited to where the consent of the data provider is given. So in other words, you can make your request to government, who's the administrator of the portal, be it the local government, provincial or national, but where it relates to certain specific facility information, that the government authority is going to first have to get the consent of the data provider in order to release it. There is one exception which it refers to, and that's where the government is allowed to release total emissions of a specific pollutant for a specific facility without first obtaining the consent from the data provider. And I've lastly mentioned there that the licensing authorities will be responsible for administering and processing these public requests. But maybe just to touch on, and I won't dwell on it because we're going to run out of time, but to a point that Quinton made, and it's a very important point that he made, the difficulty around people getting information or people not wanting to give consent to it, where they feel that they might be exposed. I think we must again, and I referred to PIA, the Promotion of Access to Information Act, we must keep in mind that again, although it's an unwieldy act, there is a very important override provision in PIA, which really allows an override of all the limitations. And if I put the limitations that the draft policy talks to, it really allows for an override of all of those limitations where it's going to be in the public interest, where there's what they call an imminent or serious threat to the environment or for harm, and where the importance of disseminating that information will override the personal interests of individuals or companies. So keep that in mind when we look at this last slide, which talks to data that, according to the draft policy, may not be provided to requester. That this relates to personal information not already in the public domain, and I've underlined not because very often a lot of people don't realize that a lot of personal information is already in the public domain. A simple example may be a license or a license application, which often goes through a public process. Very often, personal information is included in some of those documents. Further, where there's data with intellectual property rights or proprietary information, there's details of process which a company may deem to be sensitive, which very often, as we know, is the case. And material, and whether there's material throughput, where there's facility processes, efficiency of control technologies, and facilities under investigation. I put a little question mark next to efficiency of control technologies, because as I mentioned in the previous slide, my understanding is that you can get information around abatement equipment efficiencies, but with the consent of the data provider. So it's not an absolute prohibition, it's a conditional prohibition. But again, just to round off, because maybe it will be a point of discussion, all of those provisos there, all those limitations can in theory be overridden by those catch-all provisions under PIA, where you can show a justifiable case. I know the answer that will come back to me is that, have you ever tried to follow that process? It's not easy, it's very difficult, it's long-winded, and all of those comments would be absolutely true. But I certainly think in appropriate circumstances, and let's just take the one that we've had, Quinton referred to, the chemical spill down in Cornubia and Natal. If someone had to have brought an urgent application to court to obtain access to all the information that apparently is being withheld, I'm fairly confident that that override provision in PIA probably would have helped them in that particular instance, if they're not still going to use that provision. But I hope I've given you some idea of both the draft policy and some of the legal complexities that go along with it. And yeah, happy to try and answer any questions if there are any. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. I see we are running slightly over our scheduled time, so we just want to let everybody know that we'll probably go about 15 minutes over time to just allow for discussion and everything. So I think before Roelof takes over to tell us about the survey and show what is in the survey so long, there is a good question by Prof. Harold Annegaan that is addressed to the panel that actually connects to what Ian was talking about. So I'll ask the question to the panel, give them a few minutes to think about a response while Roelof takes us through the survey. So the question from Prof. Annegaan is there not a basic public right to information underlying the draft regulations? If the pollution crosses the boundary, the public has the right to the emission information. Both PIA regulations and the draft regulations put multiple admin, financial, and regulatory limitations, including on the right to further disseminate the info. 1984 doublespeak at its best. So I'll leave that with the panel to prepare a response, and then I'll hand over to Roelof to quickly go through the survey.
Thanks, Farina. So this is to make sure that you're happy with the survey before we activate it. If you think that we're not capturing the essence and we should rather take more time before we send it out to the community, I will not send it out. But so if there's any great concerns, please tell us in the chat or ask to speak. So the first thing is, I thought it's important that we capture the person's identity who's making the comments, and I think that would make it more legitimate if we include that into the formal response. So the first question is just for us, if you thought this webinar was informative, and we go from completely disagree. So if you don't agree with that statement, you say 1, and if you agree very much, you say 5. And the same for the second question. I have a good understanding of this draft policy under discussion. So after this, especially after the nice last talk, can you say you understand? If you don't understand, you select 1. If you do understand, you select 5. The third question, this is the one that says the draft SAAELIP undermines the right to information. And there I thought to just make it simple, yes, no, not sure. Then we have, this was the issue that Terry brought up. So who should be responsible for the accuracy and consistency of the record? And then from that table that Ian showed us, I said the department, the data provider, the end user, or the public, or should there be a shared responsibility? And I then added the no. Then we have this one. Do we think the draft policy can be published in its current form? And then this is based on Quentin's talk, limiting access to emission information can have significant impacts on health and safety. And then I also have this, if there's any final comments that you want to include. So if there's anyone who thinks that we're missing some very important questions, please let me know in the chat. And even if you think we should pause this effort a little bit, I would also be happy to hear your thoughts. If not, in the next let's say 2 minutes while the panel is discussing this, I'm going to activate this, and then we'll share the link in the chat box for you all to do it. And then after about 5 minutes, we'll start sharing the information.
Yeah, if I'm happy to offer a few thoughts to the Prof's question, which I think I agree with him entirely in terms of the unnecessary admin that goes along with gaining access to information. But perhaps to his point, and to some degree to Quentin's comment as well, which is valid, what the problem at the moment might in fact be is not necessarily just a distrust with industry or polluters, but I think it's a general distrust with government. Because the reality is government, and this answers both the Prof's question as well, that the reality is that government has very easy access and very quick access. They have all the authority in the world to gain access to information around emissions and other data from polluters all of the time. And I think the difficulty that we've faced with at the moment in South Africa is that there's a distrust between the community that government is able to actually look after their interests properly. And as a result, community, as Quentin's mentioned, is going about trying to do that for themselves. And that's where the difficulty comes in, because you're now allowing private individuals to try and obtain personal or proprietary information from other private individuals. And that's always a difficulty because, you know, while we can look at this in one dimension and say, well, why not? Any pollution we should all be able to see, particularly because it's not limited to your facility. There are other interests, you know, if your own personal information was suddenly able to be accessed by any other individual at any time of the day or night, you might not feel the same. So I think the difficulty we've got at the moment is really the distrust with government. And if government was able to gather the information more efficiently, use the information more efficiently, and enforce the information more efficiently, the need for private individuals to want that information would probably tail off to a large degree. I know that's probably not going to happen anytime soon, unfortunately, but perhaps that's part of the problem, if not the answer.
Thank you very much for that response, Ian. Any of our other panel members have something to add on the question of Prof. Anagan?
I agree with Prof. Anagan that there is a wish to share information which the government already has access to. And because of the public's right to that access, and yeah, that I think this could create an additional financial and administrative burden. And also those time delays I spoke of earlier, is if we have to wait for the authorities, be they local or national authorities, to respond to a request and then pass that request onto a facility and then wait for their response, there's a time burden to that. And so if there's a way to mitigate those in the request process, then I think that needs to be optimized, and that needs to be defined in this policy document.
Thank you. So we can open up the discussion to the floor also now. If you have a question, just raise your hand so we don't all speak at the same time. There is another question here from Prof. Harold for the panel, which basically connects to the previous one and the discussions we've been having. Is the government not the ultimate client for all air quality assessments in the processes of issuing and enforcing licensing and air quality management plans? In such case, the entire draft regulations creates a set of bureaucratic processes to hinder access to the information. And I think that is what we've discussed now, that the time and cost burden that this could be a great hindrance in the processes. Are there any other questions from the floor? All right, then we have another question here that was in the chat box for the panel. It's also a very, very valid question. Who decides what is confidential information? So let's open that for discussion by our panel.
Yeah, look, it's Ian. As I mentioned in the talk, the confidentiality is going to really primarily be determined by the Promotion of Access to Information Act and POPIA. Those are going to be the two key pieces of legislation that will guide you. So, for example, PIA lists different categories of information which either cannot or potentially cannot be disclosed, be it related to personal information, be it related to particular processes or products. So it sort of lists, and without going into detail, but it lists categories of information which would in principle be confidential, and then it indicates whether they are absolutely prohibited or whether they are potentially prohibited, and that will become a subjective assessment. So where it's potentially prohibited, you'd have to then look at the particular information being requested and decide whether it should be protected or not. So there's a discretion there, but principally those two pieces of legislation will be the guide, and it will guide you on what is confidential and what isn't.
Thank you for that clarification, Ian. Then we have another question from Prof. Harold. Why should emission inventory include personal information? Such metadata should be carved off when the emission inventory information is placed into the National Emission Database. Any comments on that?
I had the same thought process, it's Terry, that perhaps at the AEL application process and reporting process, facilities and their service providers can actually mark information that is that falls into those categories as Ian described, that is personal information or protected information regarding specific processes, but that then obviously requires a revamp of those systems and those portals to add that information, or to at least qualify whether or not that information is open for release to the public or at request. And that could also set aside that the consent question about going back to those facilities and asking for consent to release their data. They almost admit that they can give consent when they upload that data.
Thank you, Terry. I see Rudolf and Quinton have their hands up. So let's give Rudolf a chance to add, and then when Rudolf is done, Quinton.
So I have a question around the explicit statements of payments in the policy and whether that is needed. So it makes sense that there's a fair use policy. You know, if there's money has to be incurred, cost has to be incurred, that you recover those costs. But the question is whether that does it need to be in the policy? Because you know, in our interactions with meteorological data, that has become a big stumbling blocks because that information is sometimes prohibitively expensive. So do we need to put this in the policy?
Okay, I'm not going to respond to Rudolf, but I'm just going to respond to Harold, and it's more of a statement than a response. I would like to propose that there's the option that a facility makes or says that its information can be publicly available. You know, again, if I go back to my position, which is at some point, and Ian is quite right. You know, people could find this information out for themselves. They might find out the wrong information and might believe, and obviously they're going to believe the wrong information anyway. I think that with you know, commercial confidentiality aside, that there are very good reasons that a facility might say, I'm making my information publicly available. This is the type of industry that this is my industry that I'm operating, and I'm publishing my greenhouse gas emissions, for instance, and in my financial reports, and for my social responsibility reports, I'm publishing my information anyway. So please make this information publicly available. And I think that might be something that's worth considering.
Thank you, Quinton. I see Ian also has something to add. Go ahead, Ian.
Thanks, yeah, just following on from what Quinton says, again, PIA, the Promotion of Access to Information Act, provides exactly that platform. What in fact companies are required to do is create an information manual. And in that manual, they are supposed to specify which information they will make accessible without the need for anyone to go through the formalities of a PIA request. Now, so the tool is there. Obviously, most companies, unfortunately, by their nature, don't put a great deal of information that they'll give out free of charge, so to speak, without you having to formally apply for it. But if that trust could be built, and if there's a lot of work going on at the moment, I'm certainly with listed companies and trying to get them to be more open and transparent about things like emissions. If you got to the point where you could build that trust, you might then be able to encourage companies to improve their information manuals. And then anybody who wanted information from a particular company could simply go onto their website, have a look at the information manual, see whether, for example, emissions data is listed there, and they would then be free to request that information from that particular company. Again, not a well-used tool, but the point I also want to emphasize is a lot of the tools we're talking about actually exist. They're just not particularly efficiently found or used at this point.
Thank you very much, Ian. Okay, so Rudolf let me know that that there are some preliminary results. Yo, that's a tongue twister. Preliminary results ready to share from our survey. For those of you who have not completed it yet, please click on the link in the chat box and complete it. So I think we've gone over our time, so it's time to wrap up. Thank you very much for everybody that joined us, and for all the interaction, and thank you to our panel for the very interesting and illuminating talks. So I think I'm going to say goodbye to everyone now, and I'll leave it to Roelof to close and wrap up for us as the NACA Vice Chairperson.
Thank you very much, Farina, and thank you very much to the speakers. It was a really nice event, and as you can see, I think there's a very positive response from the 18 people that have completed the survey. So the second question, I have a good understanding. I also think that leans towards the positive end of the curve. Asking the question, the draft SAAELIP undermines the right to information. It seems that there is a large portion of the community that feels so, but also interestingly, also a large portion that says no. Who should be responsible for the accuracy and consistency of the records? These are the options that were selected. Now, Terry can correct me if I'm wrong, but as you explained, it almost seems like that is what was the intent of that the end user would be the person, the party that has to make sure the information is correct. So that's kind of interesting. The screen jumps a bit as more results coming in. So we've got then limiting access to information can have significant impacts on health and safety, and predominantly a positive response on that. Saying whether it can be published in its current form, there's at least a third of the community saying no, and a third is not sure. And then we've already got a few specific comments coming in. So thank you for that. We will keep this open, and we will also share this with a broader NACA community. And then if you want to submit more than one response, we'll make sure that we filter out the responses so that there's only one response per person. But maybe you just quickly wanted to complete and you didn't have time to give a more detailed comment. You can do that, and I'll make sure that we just keep your last response. Thank you, everybody, and let's hope that this effort will have a positive impact on air quality management in South Africa. That will be the end of today's meeting.